It's June 23, 1972. President Richard Nixon and his White House Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman were captured by the Oval Office voice-activated tape recorders, uttering the words that would make up the now famous so-called Watergate smoking gun tape. This recorded meeting would serve as the main piece of supposedly hard evidence linking the Nixon administration to, among various other crimes, the botched burglary by CIA agents, FBI agents, and Cuban exiles into the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate complex 6 days earlier. One specific passage in the tapes, spoken by President Nixon, has continued to perplex researchers and authors since the original release of the tape over 50 years ago. In discussing the recent break-in at the Watergate building, Nixon turns to the topic of E. Howard Hunt, the CIA agent who had led the operation from the White House Plumber Unit. His comments are in reference to the unfolding scandal and Nixon's worries regarding Hunt's knowledge of fundamental CIA secrets. Most importantly, as Nixon puts it, the quote-unquote whole Bay of Pigs thing. On screen now is the exact word-for-word transcript of what President Nixon said. I have cleaned this up a bit and I will read out what it says without all the ums and the ers. Here it goes. Quote, "Very bad to have this fellow Hunt. He knows too damn much and he was involved. We happen to know that. And that it gets out that this is all involved in the Cuban thing, that it's a fiasco, and it's going to make the FBI, CIA look bad. It's going to make Hunt look bad, and it's likely to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing, which we think would be very unfortunate for CIA and for the country at this time, and for American foreign policy. And he just better tough it and lay it on them." End quote. Now, many have interpreted this as Nixon proposing a last-ditch attempt to blackmail the CIA to cover up the ongoing Watergate scandal. In this moment, according to Watergate skeptics, it is likely that the president realized, as many, including myself, have come to believe as well, that the whole botched burglary has been orchestrated by the spy agency itself to facilitate Nixon's downfall. Now, with his back against the wall, Nixon proposes the mutually assured destruction ultimatum. In essence, the leaking of CIA secrets related to, among other things, the Bay of Pigs invasion and E. Howard Hunt, the Watergate burglar, if the CIA does not work to clean up their mess. For the purposes of our current investigation, I want to ask the open question. What was this so-called, quote-unquote, whole Bay of Pigs thing that Nixon felt would worry the CIA and substantially impact U.S. foreign policy? Many, including Nixon's Chief of Staff Haldeman later in life, have come to speculate that the secret Nixon held had to do in some way with the CIA's role in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which had fundamental links to the anti-Castro operations of the 1960s, as we're going to see in detail. This was also a mystery that Dick Nixon himself had worked covertly to uncover during his preceding 5 years in the White House, as we know now. Was Nixon thinking of threatening a real investigation into the killing of JFK and not another Warren Commission cover-up? Now, in many ways, Nixon's Bay of Pigs secret could easily just have been interpreted as one of the many major revelations concerning the parallel history of events during the anti-Castro craze in the early 60s. In establishment histories, we are told a version of events, for example, a failed invasion, outlandish assassination plots, Cuban exiles, and ultimately a Cuban leader that seemed to be impervious to every assassination method in the book. This traditional history provides an incomplete picture of the CIA's anti-Cuba operations, obscuring a secret paramilitarization of the CIA going on in parallel. Now, this paramilitarization of the agency in the Caribbean in the early 60s would act as the basic training, or in some terms, the soft run for the class of operators and assassins that would undertake both the secret war in Laos and the Phoenix program in Vietnam in the decade to come. And, of course, the future assassination programs of the latter Cold War. The CIA's Cuba show, which was operational for roughly 4 years from 1960 to 64, took on two simultaneous dimensions, which often intersected but remained distinct in their overall missions. The first and more overt program was the paramilitary and guerrilla warfare component of the project, to effect regime change. These operations ran the gamut, from fomenting a popular uprising against Castro's government in Cuba through the use of well-placed infiltrators, all the way up to a full-scale conventional amphibious assault, which was of course attempted during the Bay of Pigs invasion. These programs, for the most part, remained an open secret throughout Florida and eventually across the United States, as the scale and scope of the program continued to expand. To this day, the CIA's Cuba operations in the early 60s are often viewed through this lens, as simply training and financing of Miami-based Cuban exiles in their quest to overthrow Castro. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Cuban guerrilla operations were reorganized under Operation Mongoose, and took on the form of sabotage and terrorism against Cuba, and directed downwards from the White House directly. This became Bobby Kennedy's show, and his obsession. You have all likely heard of the Bay of Pigs invasion and Operation Mongoose as the two principal components of the anti-Castro CIA program, and I don't believe that to be a coincidence. As we will see later, the Bay of Pigs invasion and Mongoose, although relevant, only provide a surface-level picture of the true nature and purpose of the Cuba show, which may have been what Nixon was referring to when he threatened to leak the, quote, whole Bay of Pigs thing. The guerrilla warfare paramilitary component of the Cuba show would transmute into the core team of paramilitary experts in charge of the secret war in Laos half a decade later. This brings us to our second component of the CIA Cuba operations, being of course the assassination program. Now importantly, there is some nuance to this. I may have suggested that the paramilitary operations are all that we hear about, and that the assassination program is completely covered up, but that is obviously not the case. Mainstream sources, and even official CIA history papers, do openly acknowledge the assassination plots devised against Castro, even going so far as to acknowledge a short relationship between the agency and mafia figures to this end. However, I will argue that the common conception of the Castro assassination plots as outlandish James Bondian schemes that involve Professor Gadget trickery to kill the Cuban leadership remains a limited hangout. What was really happening in Florida, Louisiana, and Central America in the early 60s was the development and organization of the early iteration of the CIA's future counterinsurgency rural pacification programs. In simple, unvarnished terms, the rollout of the first CIA search and destroy operations and agency-financed death squads. The most famous of these future programs being, of course, the Phoenix program in South Vietnam. And then later, the support of the Nicaraguan Contras in the 70s and 80s, and, to a broader degree, Contras throughout Central America. This will all be made clear throughout our investigation, specifically today. So all this to say, even if the Cuba show was not strictly used as a testing ground for the agency's future operations, it did have the effect of elevating the careers of the men who would undertake both of the massive paramilitary programs in Laos and the nightmarish rural pacification programs in both Vietnam and Central America in the upcoming decades. Behind the boom and bang and James Bond mythology lies the honing and perfection of a paramilitary CIA. Because of course today you're watching, as Nixon would put it, the whole Bay of Pigs thing.
I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
The CIA's anti-Castro program was first proposed by a largely forgotten and often overlooked operator in the agency. The first agency policy proposal, dated December 11, 1959, was actually one of assassination, calling for the quote-unquote elimination of Castro. The drafter of the proposal was the director of the Western Hemisphere Division at the CIA, one Colonel Joseph Caldwell King. Once a West Point graduate in the mid-1920s, he proceeded to work for his father's mining company in Mexico, before joining Nelson Rockefeller's Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs during World War II, which has largely been viewed in recent years as an intelligence front that used business cover to place spies across Latin America. His experience working in Mexico as a mining executive and as one of Nelson Rockefeller's spies during the war likely landed him a spot at the new CIA in 1947. Yet, J.C. King remains a frustratingly obscure figure. According to some sources, from his post as the head of Western Hemisphere, he naturally had a role in the Guatemalan coup in 1954. But again, any further details or specifics are missing. King was a mid-level executive, not a major player, but still a Langley bureaucrat and planner. J.C. King appears in the CIA's history as the first person to suggest specific action against the newly emerged Castro regime. His original December 11, 1959 memo called for assassination, or as suggested earlier, the elimination of the Cuban leader. CIA Director Allen Dulles approved the memo, but only after sanitizing the document using a pencil, crossing out the words eliminate and replacing it with the more passive word removal. As we can see, from the very beginning of the anti-Castro operations, we are presented with two histories. The first, an obscure CIA executive, high up in the agency but almost invisible in the history, calls for the assassination of Castro. Then, the parallel, more respectable history shows the ever-diligent and trustworthy Allen Dulles crossing out the assassination language, instead rephrasing the document towards a more conventional CIA coup. Was J.C. King simply taking the fall for the agency's prominent men who likely wanted an assassination but could not come out and say it? This is not the only time that King could be used as a fall guy. Later, during an internal interview with Richard Bissell, the deputy director of plans and the main architect of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Bissell claimed that it was J.C. King and not himself who first advocated the use of mafia elements in the assassination, and later in the paramilitary portions of the anti-Castro operations. Maybe J.C. King was a true operator, or maybe he was just putting his name on the record for his bosses. J.C. King's initial memo did get the ball rolling, as according to official CIA history, on January 8, 1960, the CIA first discussed the creation of an official anti-Castro branch of the Western Hemisphere Division. And on January 18, 1960, Director of CIA Allen Dulles instructed DDP Richard Bissell to create the Western Hemisphere Branch 4, known by the cryptonym WH4. According to the paper, WH4 originally, quote, totaled 40 persons, with 18 at headquarters, 20 at Havana Station, and 2 at Santiago Base, end quote. This initial 40 members was likely where the commonly used name for the later Assassination Corps group was born, that being the now infamous Operation 40, as we will discuss much more later. Back in these early days of the Cuban Revolution, the CIA still had a presence in Cuba itself, and the 20 agents assigned to Havana and the 2 in Santiago would work on the first recruitment efforts in assembling the exile army later that year. The Bay of Pigs invasion planning started in the last year of Eisenhower's presidency, as a joint CIA-White House venture. Accordingly, the top of the organizational structure saw a joint effort between Allen Dulles, from the CIA, working alongside Vice President Richard Nixon, acting as the political liaison on the project. Below Nixon and Dulles was Richard Bissell, as previously mentioned, the deputy director of plans at the CIA, and by all accounts, a Dulles protege. Many viewed Bissell as being the natural successor to Dulles in the top spot at the CIA, as he was a true spy's spy like his mentor. He came from the same Ivy League background as his boss, graduating from Yale in the 1930s, and had been one of the founding members of the CIA. Bissell, by this point in his career, had amassed an impressive resume of experience in spycraft. He had first entered the spotlight as the main Langley planner of the Guatemalan coup d'etat in 1954, Operation PB Success, which overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz. Additionally, Bissell had been given authority over both the U-2 spy plane program and the evolving spy satellite program at the CIA. By 1960, Bissell had been in the role of Deputy Director of Plans for a little under 2 years, replacing the legendary Frank Wisner, arguably the main architect of the CIA's Cold War regime change operations in the early days. Therefore, with a growing portfolio of duties, his prominence as a CIA old boy, and as Frank Wisner's successor as DDP, Bissell would relish in the opportunity to head the planning for the first anti-Cuba operations from his new role, and what eventually would evolve into a full amphibious assault in a year's time. Although on paper the CIA's Bay of Pigs invasion can trace its origins back to one memo in 1959 from the obscure Colonel J.C. King of the Western Hemisphere Division, Richard Bissell had likely heard these ideas and concepts swirling around the high society circles and gatherings that he often attended in the Washington, D.C. area. You see, much like his boss Allen Dulles and his close confidant, counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton, Bissell belonged to the close-knit and elitist East Coast establishment which had once dominated the U.S. intelligence and statecraft apparatus. The faction of old boys in Washington, D.C. was coined as the Georgetown Set, named after the posh suburb of Washington, D.C., where many of these spooks lived. Richard Bissell featured prominently as a gregarious schmoozer within the parties of this informal grouping. Since the early 1950s, this group of prominent former OSS agents, government bureaucrats, establishment journalists, and politicians met informally at cocktail parties and functions in the posh Georgetown suburb of Washington, D.C. Continuing the oh-so-social legacy of the OSS, the Georgetown set quickly emerged in the post-war years as a separate forum of CIA agents, asset journalists, and bureaucrats to meet and collude on intelligence operations. At the center of the Georgetown set were some of the foremost early CIA executives. Frank Wisner, the first head of the Office of Policy Coordination and the second deputy director of plans, otherwise known as the director of covert operations in the CIA, would represent the center of the Georgetown set, until his descent into madness in 1958, followed by bouts of electroshock and his eventual suicide in 1965. Future CIA director under Nixon, Richard Helms, attended these parties alongside Tracy Barnes, Richard Bissell's deputy and a major organizer of the Bay of Pigs. Also present was the future overseer of the CIA's early incursions into Laos, one Desmond Fitzgerald. It's been a while, but you'll remember him from part 4 of my Laos series as the man who authorized the first operations to arm the Hmong in Laos. Also later to be involved with the anti-Cuba activities in Miami. Alan Dulles and his counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton were also known to drop by in the Georgetown parties, making some of these gatherings a real who's who of the early CIA spooks. Now, what made the Georgetown set particularly unique was the inclusion of a wide array of CIA-sponsored journalists amongst their ranks. These included Thomas Braden, which we originally met in my CIA history episode on French Gladio. Philip Graham, who I should mention worked in the OSS as an assistant to Wild Bill Donovan, and then later worked for the World Bank before becoming a Washington Post journalist. David K.E. Bruce, another former OSS agent and esteemed ambassador. And of course, the Alsop brothers, Joseph and Stuart. It was Joseph Alsop, specifically, the journalist of choice of the China lobby, that hosted many of these Georgetown parties. David Talbot, in his book Brothers, characterizes Joseph Alsop's Georgetown house as a salon of sorts, harkening back to the old salons of pre-revolutionary France, where the aristocratic elites would gather and share ideas and network with academics and artists. The closeness of the spooks and the journalists worked symbiotically. The journalists would get the latest scoops on global events, allowing them to publish the first stories on the latest happenings in the Cold War hotspots. And for the spies, having immediate access to Washington's most prominent press corps allowed them to quite effectively control the media narrative surrounding future targets for operations. In many ways, we could see the Georgetown party scene as the origin point of the fabled CIA Operation Mockingbird, which is said to encompass all alleged and confirmed CIA operations working to manipulate media narratives and to influence the press to publish favorable stories to business interests. At these parties were several CIA-sponsored journalists and the top propaganda staff of the CIA, who was a man named Cord Meyer, James Angleton's deputy. Cord Meyer was instrumental in setting up several CIA propaganda fronts such as Radio Free Europe under the International Organizations Division of CIA. He was also the man who allegedly coined the now infamous term the quote-unquote compatible left, or in other words, left-wing organizations that were seen as compatible and thus workable allies, at least temporarily, for the CIA to employ in opposing communism and the radical left. These compatible left entities were often social democratic parties, moderate trade unions, or any other ostensibly leftist group that was compatible with capital. And finally, next to these top CIA spies and their friendly journalists was a coterie of the top American bureaucrats and government officials. Included in this mix were most of the Truman administration's top staff. Dean Acheson, William Averell Harriman, John McCloy, and of course, Paul Nitz, the author of NSC 68 in 1950, the original blueprint for a permanent war economy in the United States. These American luminaries would continue to advise presidents until at least the 1980s, providing a direct line between policymaking and the CIA through these informal and clandestine Georgetown meetings. Even future President Kennedy was alleged to have attended a few of these Georgetown functions. Kennedy, himself a prominent member of a Massachusetts elite family, was adjacent to the perennial blue-blooded members of the Georgetown set. These parties would allegedly have a significant impact on Kennedy's future presidency. For one, the presidential candidate was approached by journalist Joseph Alsop, the same Alsop who had covered the Laos crisis, first under rumored CIA cover, in 1959. Alsop made a strange recommendation to the young senator at the Democratic Convention in LA in 1960. It was reported that he recommended Kennedy choose Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Senate Majority Leader from Texas, and his defeated opponent in the 1960 Democratic primaries, to be his running mate against Vice President Richard Nixon. This is a somewhat puzzling recommendation. Johnson was by no means a member of the Georgetown Circle, instead, belonging to the petro-fueled political elite in Texas. Johnson was a Protestant Texan, who may have simply been a strategic suggestion by Alsop to help Kennedy carry states in the South that he otherwise would have struggled to win as a Catholic Northerner. But regarding JFK and the CIA, throughout the 1960 presidential campaign, rumors persisted that Allen Dulles, or at least one of his subordinates, was feeding internal intelligence to the Kennedy camp regarding Cuba, likely through Georgetown sources such as the constellation of journalists and bureaucrats that attended these same circles. These rumors were largely attributed to Kennedy's statements on the campaign trail, lambasting Nixon for not taking a harder stance on Cuba. Nixon, who was heavily involved in the top-secret Bay of Pigs invasion planning, was bound by this secret and could not retaliate when Kennedy implied that the White House should be arming and funding the Miami Cuban exiles, a program that I'll remind you was underway at the time under Nixon's office. Therefore, due to his proximity to the ongoing planning, Nixon was forced to feign weakness on Cuba to protect the ongoing operations, and Kennedy flanked the vice president on the issue, looking like the hardliner. Whether this had a decisive impact in the election, which was the closest in U.S. history at the time, is unclear, but it did, however, force Kennedy to follow through with his strong campaign rhetoric against Castro and his firm commitment to arm the exiles. While Kennedy campaigned on strong action in the Caribbean, the lame duck President Ike stepped aside, and in 1960, the CIA prepared the Bay of Pigs operation for either the incoming Nixon administration or the new face Kennedy. DDP Richard Bissell moved his pieces into place. In early 1960, J.C. King, head of the Western Hemisphere Division at CIA, assigned Jacob Esterline as the task force chief of the new WH-4 group, the working-level team devising simultaneously both the Castro assassination and Cuban invasion operations. Jake Esterline was an agency veteran, having started his career in OSS Detachment 101 in Southeast Asia, as a paramilitary expert, clearing the way for Miami-based Colonel Paul Helliwell and his OSS Detachment 202 boys to establish themselves there. Esterline's paramilitary expertise was put to use post-war in the CIA, as he was then shipped to several posts across Latin America. He was reportedly a paramilitary advisor for the CIA's PB Success, the overthrow of Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954, as I previously mentioned. As I mentioned before, though, in the previous part, the PB Success group was largely transferred over to the Bay of Pigs operation some 6 years later. Jacob Esterline was no exception, as he was called from his posting in Venezuela in early 1960 to become the CIA's main on-the-ground director in the evolving Bay of Pigs invasion. Esterline would organize and direct not only the elite training for Operation 40, but also the more broad combat training provided to the larger Bay of Pigs invasion force, first organized largely under Brigade 2506 in rural Guatemala. Throughout 1960, the newly bolstered CIA JM Wave Station in Miami worked to engage the local Cuban exile community in South Florida. Following the Cuban Revolution, a consistent stream of Cuban migrants, for the most part opposed to Castro, established themselves in and around Miami, creating a bustling little Havana in the Sunshine State. Although united in their anti-Castro sentiments, these groups represented a constellation of different micro-factions and political positions, ranging from anti-communist leftists all the way to ultra-reactionary members of the former Batista regime. This wide array of assets were fostered by the agency as the main contingent of soldiers used against Castro in the Bay of Pigs and beyond. Although Eisenhower gave a near unrestricted green light to the CIA to conduct their operations in the Caribbean, the use of Cubans in the operations did provide a natural veil of cover, and of course, the ever-loved plausible deniability for the United States in their secret war against the new Cuban regime. The invasion army, quickly grouping up in rural Guatemala, would be presented to the world as a grassroots Cuban effort. At least that was the idea anyway. Pretty quickly, the entire region, including Fidel Castro himself, were made keenly aware of the CIA's very direct role in funding, training, and arming the Bay of Pigs Brigade 2506, despite the use of mostly Cuban assets in the actual invasion itself. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a massive open secret by the time it kicked off on April 17, 1961. And as we will see, this may have been somewhat intentional, as the Bay of Pigs invasion acted as the first widely publicized CIA failure in the Cuba project, failures that largely overshadowed the other less public successful developments in this milieu. So how did the Bay of Pigs invasion become an open secret, and a reported agency failure? And what would the agency gain from such an obviously flawed plan? Well, let's dive in. Although the CIA would recruit their invasion force in Florida, the agency was technically still not allowed to operate on domestic soil, and thus had to find a foreign host for their training camp. Richard Bissell was eventually able to secure a plot in Guatemala, a country which I will remind you had some 6 years earlier witnessed a CIA-funded coup in its capital. The Bay of Pigs training camp was provided by a Guatemalan plantation owner named Roberto Alejos, brother to the Guatemalan ambassador in Washington, D.C., Carlos Alejos. The abandoned coffee plantation that would by August 19, 1960 be home to the first 100 or so Cuban invaders was to be known as Base Trax, and the army trained there would be Brigade 2506, headed by one Manuel Artime. Dr. Manuel Artime Buesa, the Cuban physician who had once fought alongside Castro against Batista and even served briefly in the revolutionary government, fled Cuba in 1959 and ended up in Mexico. There he was first recruited by CIA man Bernard Barker, who I must note here would become a future Watergate burglar in 1972 and will by no means be the last that we will be coming across today. Anyways, well-spoken and clean-cut Dr. Artime would be the public face of the CIA anti-Castro program, and his organization, the Movimiento de Recuperación Revolucionaria, or MRR for short, would be chosen as the major sponsored political organization intended to form a quote-unquote government in arms on the Cuban coast. Because you see, and this is a major misconception about the Bay of Pigs invasion, but the plan was more nuanced than simply invading Cuba and overthrowing the government. The plan hatched in Langley and sought to temporarily embed Artime's MRR government in Cuba and to have them declare themselves as a quote-unquote government in arms. According to international law, once an autonomous entity is able to secure a region of land by arms for 72 hours and declare itself a government, the Neutrality Act becomes void, and foreign powers can thus support the government in arms overtly, as if they are the legitimate government of the state. Therefore, the Bay of Pigs operation was meant to be the prelude to a wider official U.S. intervention, likely by Marines with air support. At least this was the idea on paper, when an invasion force of some 10,000 men did still seem achievable. Despite early optimism, by the end of the year-long build-up to the Bay of Pigs, the exile army only ever topped a little over 1,500 combatants. Placed on the ground in South Florida by Richard Bissell as the quote-unquote political officer of the operation was the ubiquitous E. Howard Hunt, who would be in charge of the early Bay of Pigs recruitment efforts out of the JM Wave station in Miami. You'll remember Hunt as it was his involvement in Watergate that alarmed Nixon, as we covered at the beginning of this episode. Although his role in the operation in Miami remains vague, as the political officer, it does appear that Hunt's, or as he was known by the Cuban exiles, Eduardo's role was likely to act as the CIA's liaison with the Cuban exile groups in Florida and to coordinate weapons and cash to the disparate factions and parties. I should note that Eduardo Hunt was reported to have been in contact with certain mob figures around the Miami area, even as early as 1960. According to the classic biography of Frank the Irishman Sheeran, titled I Heard You Paint Houses, now adapted by Martin Scorsese into the film The Irishman, Frank Sheeran, a bodyguard and close mob associate to Jimmy Hoffa and Russell Bufalino of the Pennsylvania outfit, was witness and participated in a gun shipment to a reported CIA figure going by Hunt in the Miami area. At least that's what he alleges. Take this with whatever legitimacy you choose to. It could also just be Sheeran trying to boost his legacy. Despite the lofty tales, Hunt and his CIA colleagues' recruitment efforts in Miami were continuously plagued by rumors within the Cuban community of a massive CIA army waiting in the jungles of Guatemala. Additionally, penetration was a constant issue, as Castro embedded agents throughout the Miami area to spy on exile and agency efforts and to report back to Havana. It's been alleged that even mob boss Santo Trafficante, a future CIA mob ally, was himself working as a double agent for both Castro and the CIA during this period. We'll get more into that next time. This penetration of Castro agents ran across the entire operation, and from the beginning, Castro was aware of Yankee plotting. Nonetheless, by November 4th, 1960, days before the presidential election, the first 430 Cubans and CIA paramilitary staff had established themselves in Guatemala, gathered at Fort Trax in the Sierra Madre Mountains of western Guatemala, as you can see on the map on screen. The campsite's conditions were miserable. Found 7,000 feet up in the air, the provided plantation was on volcanic ground soil that would quickly transform into difficult to traverse mud following the constant heavy rain. Most problematic to the operation itself was the base camp's proximity to several other active coffee plantations, staffed by mostly local indigenous workers. If knowledge of base Trax had not already reached Castro via Miami spies, the news then quickly made its way to Havana via either a Guatemalan spy or a Cuban double agent in the camp. Now, nonetheless, base Trax was built, and although the invasion force remained small, the training went ahead. The plan had just shifted away from guerrilla training towards an amphibious assault, not too dissimilar to the island-hopping missions in the Pacific theater of World War II. Slowly, small vehicles and weapons were brought in by the CIA-financed shell companies, likely overseen by figures such as Miami CIA paymaster Paul Helliwell. The first paramilitary trainers arrived in the early fall, most of them CIA contract workers and former assets from the agency's gun-running operations during the Cuban Revolution. From this point, guerrilla training had not been completely eliminated from the plan. Instead, the CIA gave select elite training to a smaller group of exiles, the ones deemed the most hardened, ideological, and battle-tested. CIA trainers at Fort Trax began to separate the top of the exile crop into a separate side group. What emerged from this smaller band of commandos was the critical side project to the Bay of Pigs invasion, Operation 40. I should begin by stating that the term Operation 40 from my research is never mentioned by name in any declassified or official agency material. Although it is never mentioned by name by official agency sources, several agency-employed Cuban exiles have over the years referred to the elusive Op 40, and have shed some light on the purpose of the group. In a sense, Operation 40 seemed to act more as an umbrella term or a shorthand for the most elite division of Cuban assets. For the purposes of this video and clarity, I will use the Operation 40 label as a catch-all term for this organization of elite Cuban assets separated from the Brigade 2506 invasion force. Interestingly, Operation 40 has actually been depicted in popular media, most prominently in the first Call of Duty Black Ops game, as one of the playable factions in the Cuba level and the associated multiplayer map. This is where I first heard of this term as a teenager. The game even included a piece of fictitious collectible intel that includes J.C. King's name and authorization to create Operation 40. It appears that the game's writers did their homework. Of course, it should go without saying that this depiction does still clearly whitewash the broader implications of this program. As we will see, the Call of Duty depiction of Operation 40 as an elite squad of Americans and Cubans sent on a Rambo-like mission to kill Castro remains unsurprisingly only one dimension of the often misinterpreted and misrepresented squad. According to exile sources, Operation 40 was one of the first CIA forays into creating from scratch the intelligence agency of another state. This group was organized initially to become the new intelligence apparatus of a post-Castro Cuban regime. In reality, however, with Castro remaining in power, the original Operation 40 crew, gathered between 1960 and 61, would become a sort of in-house private intelligence network within the CIA. This sounds like a contradiction, right? How can a state intelligence agency like the CIA have a private element within? Well, as I have described before, the Cuban exiles in Operation 40 would become the sort of contract workers and outsourced assets for many of the CIA's most controversial operations of the next decades. These were not US citizens, which critically established a veil of plausible deniability when using these agents. Most of these men had been former Batista regime hardliners, often having a past either in the Cuban army or in Batista's secret police. The US trainers of Operation 40, from my understanding, sought to provide all-around operator training to the new Cuban spooks, including guerrilla warfare, spycraft, sometimes pilot training, and counterinsurgency tactics. Commonly, Op 40 is seen as a CIA assassination unit, and there is some truth in that, but that was only one aspect of the training provided to the new Cuban intel assets. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the Kennedy administration's in-house historian and a special assistant to the president, wrote maybe the most damning memo about Operation 40 on June 9, 1961, to Kennedy aide Richard Goodwin. Hey there, this is Eyes Wide Open, actually from the present, or future, whatever you want to call it. Anyways, originally when this video came out on Patreon some months back, I only had access to a reproduction of the alleged memo, a typed copy from a Brigade 2506 veterans website. You can see that on screen now. Originally, I tried to track down the original memo, but was unable to find it when the video first aired. I searched and searched to no avail. But one of my Patreon supporters here, who I'm going to shout out because I got his permission to, David Myron, thank you, was able to put in a request to the National Archives Records Administration where the memo was stored. Well, they got back to him. And now, as you can see on screen, is the scan of the original memo from Schlesinger to Dick Goodwin in its entirety. Importantly, I do believe that this, alongside a tweet I made a few months ago, is the first time that it has appeared online in its entirety. So most importantly, thank you, David, from myself and from everybody that is watching right now for digging this up. I actually want to say a special shout out to David because he's actually helped me with some other research over on Patreon. We've actually become pretty good friends just chatting about different topics. He seems to be really interested in the same things as I am on this channel. So thank you again, David, for all your help. And I guess I could just take this time to say if you are a Patreon supporter and haven't checked out the Discord yet, there are some pretty good discussions going on over there, as well as a sneak peek into my research process. So anyways, let's get back to the memo. And let's get back to the topic on hand. The memo is possibly the most transparent account of Operation 40 from an official government source. Schlesinger states the following, quote, "It was called Operation 40 because originally only 40 men were involved. Later the group was enlarged to 70, end quote. I should note here that other sources claimed that later the group capped out at about 90 Cuban spooks by 1962. Anyways, Schlesinger continues, quote, "The ostensible purpose of Operation 40 was to administer liberated territories in Cuba. But the CIA agent in charge, a man known as Felix, trained the members of the group in methods of third-degree interrogation, torture, and general terrorism," end quote. Now this is interesting because the official exile leader of Operation 40 was former Cuban Colonel Vicente Leon. However, by the time of Schlesinger's memo, Leon had died at the Bay of Pigs invasion and must have been replaced by this man named Felix, which has to be none other than Felix Rodriguez, a future operator in Southeast Asia, Che Guevara's reported assassin in Bolivia, and later a key player in Iran-Contra. He would also be suspected and accused by many of involvement in the death of DEA agent Kiki Camarena. But that's a whole other story that I don't have time for today. Felix Rodriguez had been the son of a rich landowning family in pre-revolutionary Cuba. According to his own words, his entire family had either been killed or imprisoned following Castro's rise to power. Left orphaned, the young Rodriguez linked up with sometime CIA asset Frank Sturgis, and fought under him as an anti-Castro guerrilla in Cuba, before smuggling his way out to Miami in 1960 and joining Operation 40. Rodriguez, in a sense, would become a war junkie, ferrying across the globe for the CIA over the next decades, building his mythology as a crusader against communism. Anyways, this Schlesinger memo is the only place where I've seen Felix Rodriguez noted as the leader of Op 40, but it makes sense, given Rodriguez's prolific career with the CIA after the Cuba show, and his closeness to the future JM Wave station chief Ted Shackley, as we'll get into a bit later. Schlesinger concludes this thought by stating, quote, "The liberal Cuban exiles believed that the real purpose of Operation 40 was to quote-unquote kill communists, and after eliminating hardcore Fidelistas, to go on to eliminate first the followers of Ray, then the followers of Verona, and finally to set up a right-wing dictatorship, presumably under Artime." End quote. From Schlesinger's memo in June 1961, we get a picture of Operation 40 as a sort of death squad to be unleashed in Cuba after the Bay of Pigs. We also get a glimpse at the true plans for the CIA to install a pro-agency puppet dictator in Artime to replace Castro. Schlesinger's memo is further corroborated in December 1977 at the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which interviewed William Turner, a former FBI man who was dismissed by the Bureau in 1961. After suing Hoover and losing, he became a private investigator, with his first beat being the JFK assassination in 1964. He would eventually work on former FBI agent and current New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's investigation team in the mid-1960s, when he would make his breakthroughs in the Kennedy case, bringing Guy Bannister, David Ferrie, and Clay Shaw to the forefront. Anyways, in the 1977 HSCA interview of Turner, which I have linked below, Turner shared some details he gathered from a past interview he conducted with CIA Cuban exile and Operation 40 asset Felipe de Diego. Felipe de Diego would emerge in the American psyche as one of E. Howard Hunt's Watergate assets, having been caught breaking into the office of Dr. Lewis J. Fielding to allegedly steal the psychiatric files on one Daniel Ellsberg, the man who leaked the Pentagon Papers. Again, Watergate is a whole can of worms, and there's a lot to say about this, but I will exercise some restraint here. What is important here is that De Diego started in Operation 40 and ended up in Watergate under E. Howard Hunt. Again, the whole Bay of Pigs thing. In his interview, De Diego claimed that he attended Special Forces training at Fort Benning, Georgia before the Bay of Pigs invasion, indicating maybe one of the potential sites that the elite Cuban squad were being trained, one separated from the Guatemala camp. He claimed the following, quote, "Operation 40 was the intelligence branch of the 2506 Brigade and brought along assassins since it was believed that some of the Cuban leaders would have to be eliminated permanently." End quote. This passage brings up a recurring conception of Operation 40, not only as a targeted assassination squad, but as some sort of coordinated death squad, used to purge villages as the Brigade 2506 swept across Cuba. These same tactics would reemerge in Vietnam under the Phoenix program, administered once again by Operation 40 agents and exiles. In a May 1961 interview, Manuel Ray, an exile leader of the MRP, stated that Operation 40 assets were to, quote, "follow behind the invading troops and, quote-unquote, purge the captured cities and towns," end quote. He further condemned the entire show and claimed that one member of the group was a, quote-unquote, war criminal in Cuba. Mind you, this is the testimony of a Cuban exile in 1961, right in the thick of the anti-Castro fever, who was broadly sympathetic to the Brigade 2506 invasion and wholly antagonistic to Castro. This testament shows how even within the radical Cuban exile community, Operation 40 was perceived as a group of assassins, thugs, and war criminals. Of course, their post-Cuba activities would not help in this perception. The CIA trainers of Operation 40 assets are also indicative of the wide scope of training that was likely impressed upon the elite squad. According to De Diego and many other testimonies, E. Howard Hunt, the PB Success agent, Miami political officer, and future Watergate burglar, was one of the agents in charge of training. We can deduce that Hunt brought spycraft and regime change experience to the table and was likely the intelligence expert on the training staff. Hunt would famously, as I've mentioned, bring many of these Op 40 operators into the White House plumber unit in the late 60s and early 70s under Nixon. The CIA assassination trainer on Operation 40 was a man who I have yet to discuss in detail, but remains one of the most bone-chilling and ruthless CIA agents to emerge from the early agency. His name was David Sanchez Morales, also known by his nickname, El Indio. Born to a Mexican father and an indigenous mother, Morales started his career in the Army, enlisting in 1946 and serving until at least 1950. According to his declassified personnel record, Morales' brother also served as a first lieutenant and jet pilot instructor in Arizona. For David, he spent his Army career at Fort Bragg Military Base in North Carolina, one of the major bases that would train future Army Special Forces. Morales started his career at CIA sometime in the early 50s. It is unclear how an obscure army corporal was screened to become one of the agency's premier experts on assassination, but I'm sure the story is disturbing. With various postings throughout Latin America, Morales worked alongside fellow future PB Success and Bay of Pigs operatives E. Howard Hunt and David Atlee Phillips. His bilingualism in both English and Spanish was likely an asset, especially later working with Cuban exiles. Before being brought on to train the Cuban exiles in Operation 40, David Morales had worked for 2 years at the Havana station in Cuba, where he had formed significant contacts with the anti-Castro underground and Batista government officials. Hunt and Morales would reunite in Miami to train the cadres of Operation 40. According to an interview with Dave Morales conducted on May 25, 1961, only a month after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, he notes that the principal group were 39 selected highly educated Cubans who were trained as case officers to form the future intelligence service. Once again, if we include Morales into the 39, we are given the 40 of Operation 40. In the interview, he refers to the 39 recruits by the term AMOTs, which is likely the cryptonym for Operation 40. Additionally, he details AMFAST and AMCHURS, the former being a counterintelligence division and the latter being a political division, which altogether these three groups would form the future Cuban intelligence agency in a Western-friendly Cuba. Altogether, this would be about a 200-man agency, with the AMOT's Operation 40 squad being the covert operations men within this new agency. Morales would build a reputation in Miami and around Langley as a cold operator and assassin. According to Thomas Kleins, future deputy at JM Wave in Miami and a close associate of Morales, quote, "If you saw Morales walking down the street of a Latin American capital, you knew a coup was about to happen," end quote. Unlike other CIA operators, who remained aloof or dismissive when asked about their role in major scandals and assassinations, Morales would allegedly openly discuss his role in the assassination of both Kennedys, stating in 1973 that he, quote, "was in Dallas when we got the son of a bitch, and I was in Los Angeles when we got the little bastard," end quote. Such blatant admission of a direct role in the slaying of the brothers is shocking, and Morales' candidness surrounding the events may have caused his sudden death by a quote-unquote heart attack in 1978, a few weeks before he was called to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Nonetheless, Morales worked to train the Operation 40 Frente group in the dark arts of assassination and counterinsurgency, work that he would later undertake in Laos under U.S. aid cover, training Hmong guerrillas. Not only would Morales participate in the CIA's secret war in Laos, he would then also transfer into Phoenix in South Vietnam, another CIA counterinsurgency project, both under his former boss, Ted Shackley. The future exploits of the original Operation 40 team throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s would be a testament to the nature of the training provided by both Howard Hunt and David Morales. Alongside Hunt and Morales were reportedly other CIA assets that remained officially off the books, according to CIA statements. Such assets included Frank Sturgis, who was reportedly present, according to exiles, and none other than Barry Seal, future CIA drug smuggling pilot during the Iran-Contra era. We know that Barry Seal was present from a photograph uncovered by the late investigative journalist Daniel Hopsicker. He included this postcard in his book Barry and the Boys, taken on March 29, 1961, provided by Barry's widow to the author. On the back, Barry wrote, quote, "I am probably going to stay at this picture a couple of days," end quote. In the picture is the volcano overlooking Lake Atitlan, right next to base Trax in Guatemala. This almost indisputably places Barry Seal as, at the very least, a trainer, likely an aviation trainer, with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, when it comes to the actual Cuban recruits of Operation 40, I will end off with a couple of examples to show how prominent they became in the post-Cuba era of the CIA, but also Western Hemisphere intelligence more broadly. Firstly, we have the likes of Rafael Chichi Quintero, originally a Frank Sturgis soldier in anti-Castro guerrilla operations in pre-revolutionary Cuba, probably alongside Felix Rodriguez as well. Quintero would remain one of the most prolific members of the original Operation 40 squad, attaching himself closely to future JM Wave Station Chief Ted Shackley and especially his deputy Thomas Kleins, as we will see later. In the early 70s, Quintero would be one of the few CIA Cubans to end up embedded in the Mexican governmental oil company known as Pemex. Kleins, with the help of naval intelligence asset and former CIA agent Ed Wilson, would work to embed his assets into Pemex to provide business cover to their future arms and narcotics smuggling. Pemex was filled with CIA assets, another of which was an agent named Ricardo Chavez, a Mexican agent that had led a paramilitary squad with Operation 40 Exiles in, of all places, the Congo in the mid-1960s. Hunting Che Guevara. Of course, we can't mention Pemex without also mentioning George H.W. Bush, who in the early 60s, around the same time that Operation 40 was being established, was himself in close dealings with the top staff at Pemex. We will talk much more about Bush's connection to the Bay of Pigs in the next part of this series. Quintero, as an ostensible Pemex employee, would work with Shockley and Kleins, now ostensibly private businessmen, in the late 70s and early 80s on various international weapons deals, all in strange ways tied to Iran-Contra. While the likes of Quintero and Chavez went the white-collar route, working on CIA arms and narcotics shipment from the cover of do-nothing jobs at Pemex, other Operation 40 veterans, like leader Felix Rodriguez, transitioned to working as private hitmen and assassins to be employed by not only the CIA, but also the intelligence agencies of the Western-friendly regimes in South and Central America, under the infamous Operation Condor. This is where Operation 40 mercenary and future terrorist Orlando Bosch and his crew emerge. Orlando Bosch and his associates Orlando Garcia and Ignacio Novo were suspected in the killing of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. on September 21, 1976, on contract from Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet's intelligence agency, DINA. Letelier had been Minister of National Defense of Chile under President Salvador Allende, whom the CIA had helped overthrow in 1973. Forced into exile, the former defense minister and economist, after a year in a Chilean prison, left to the United States, where he taught at the American University in D.C. Letelier became the most prominent critic of the U.S.-supported regime of Augusto Pinochet in Chile. Out of the Bosch crew, the most standout to me was Ricardo Monkey Morales, a former Operation 40 commando who was known as the explosives expert. Ricardo Morales has been heavily suspected of building the car bomb that killed Orlando Letelier. Morales himself had actually been a part of the CIA Cuban Congo crew until 1965, alongside Mexican CIA asset and future Pemex employee Ricardo Chavez. In the late 60s, Monkey Morales was arrested for several murders in the United States, most prominently bombing charges in Miami in 1968. Now, according to a 1978 New York Times article, Morales is referred to as quote-unquote prosecution proof, as he went free as an FBI informant. Shortly after, Morales would appear as the lead witness in the 1968 trial of Orlando Bosch, eventually convicted of firing a bazooka from Key Biscayne at a Polish freighter headed for Cuba. Bosch was paroled in 1972 and moved to Venezuela, and then the Dominican Republic, where he headed an anti-Castro terrorist group called the Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations. The most shocking and disturbing of their crimes was the bombing of Cubana Flight 455 in 1976, killing 73 passengers. It is believed that they were hired by Venezuelan intelligence, or at the very least had cover of a Venezuelan private intelligence firm. Regardless, the Orlando Bosch and Ricardo Morales group of Operation 40 veterans were emblematic of how some of the Cuban assets were reemployed as plausibly independent Condor agents, used to assassinate political enemies and to engage in acts of terror. Gayton Fonzie, in his research for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, noted that in the 1968 trial of Orlando Bosch for the bazooka incident, head witness Ricardo Morales brought forward a tape of an alleged secret meeting between the FBI informant and Bosch. In this recorded meeting, Morales allegedly talked about a, quote, fellow named Hunt who, quote, gave $15,000 to some representatives of Cuban power to place bombs, end quote. Hunt here is almost certainly E. Howard Hunt of Operation 40 and later of the Watergate burglary. Could this be part of Nixon's whole Bay of Pigs thing, secret regarding Hunt 4 years later? Another interpretation, of course, is that Ricardo Morales, disillusioned by the CIA dropping him after the Congo operation in 1965, was attempting to rope the agency into the bazooka incident, especially as he was now an asset of the FBI who offered him a lifeline. A lot to think about here. But to wrap up with Operation 40, on screen now I have one more photo to show you, which is the cover photo from Daniel Hopsicker's Barry and the Boys. The photo was allegedly taken on January 22nd, 1963 in Mexico City, exactly 10 months before the Kennedy assassination. The photo, taken from Barry Seal's house by the author, is labeled in the book as the only extant photo of the Operation 40 squad. Of course, many are missing, but if we take this at face value, we gain some interesting insights. Now, warning. Moving forward, this is all speculation on the people depicted in the photo. I have no way to be certain that these are in fact the people suspected. A lot of this is my speculation, including Daniel Hopsicker's and other people online. So front left on the table looks to be quite clearly Felix Rodriguez, who was the purported leader of Operation 40. Felix Rodriguez's origins in Operation 40 present a direct link between the development of an assassination team to assassinate Castro and to purge his followers, and the future CIA rural pacification program in Vietnam known as Phoenix, which Rodriguez would participate in the early 70s. There, he would be reunited in Saigon with his former JM Wave boss Ted Shockley, who would be directing Phoenix by this point. Now, next to Felix Rodriguez is who Dan Hopsicker speculates, and again, this is all speculation, so he speculates that this is Porter Goss, who served as CIA director from 2005 to 2006 under George W. Bush. I have some comparison shots on screen now. Although Porter Goss served in the Caribbean for the CIA during this time, I'm not completely convinced that this is him. It doesn't look that convincing, but that's just me. Next to Porter Goss, of course, is Barry Seal, and this one is almost undisputable to me. The resemblance is too close. He was the CIA pilot we covered extensively in the last part, and who is portrayed by Tom Cruise in the huge limited hangout film that is American Made. Barry, of course, was present at the Bay of Pigs and seemingly an honorary member of Operation 40. Although I do have an interpretation of this photo. If we do accept the assumption that this is Barry Seal and this is Porter Goss, it does seem strange to me that all these Cuban exiles are sitting around a table, and next to the leader of Operation 40 are two American CIA assets, who are likely not direct members of Operation 40. These two clearly stand out here. It's almost like they were guests of honor, sitting next to the chief, Felix Rodriguez, dropping by Mexico City to meet the Operation 40 crew and check in or deliver a briefing from Langley. The timing of this picture, some 10 months before the Kennedy hit, would also further fuel my speculation on what this could have been a meeting about. Anyways, it might not come to a surprise now, but Barry Seal would allegedly pop up again in Laos in the 1960s, shipping dope for Air America. One last interesting connection is that Barry Seal in the late 1960s, while allegedly working as a CIA narco pilot, was given a corporate cover as the youngest commercial jet pilot in the world by none other than Trans World Airlines, owned of course by Howard Hughes. It's unlikely that Barry Seal ever flew a commercial flight, but nonetheless we see Howard Hughes poking out to help CIA assets, a trend that we will continue to see throughout the Cuba show. On the other side of the table is a man covering his face. It has been proposed that this is Frank Sturgis. You can identify him allegedly by his signature pompadour haircut. The sometimes official, sometimes unofficial CIA asset, who was firstly Cuban gun running and later a Bay of Pigs trainer, would also reemerge as a Watergate burglar in the 1970s. Once again, bringing the whole Bay of Pigs thing back in focus. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that this is Frank Sturgis either. I should note, the eyes don't seem right to me. Others have suggested that this may just be another Cuban member of Operation 40. There was a name attached to it. I wasn't able to dig it up. But maybe this could be an interesting exercise to try to put a name to each of the faces. There were a few faces here that did look somewhat comparable to some of the names that we've spoken about today. There's one here that I thought kind of looked like Chichi Quintero, but it's hard to tell. So maybe this is something that I'll work on in the future. But all that to say, when establishment histories decry the ultimate failure of the CIA at the Bay of Pigs, they are only telling you half the story. The stated objective of invading Cuba and setting up a government in arms, as we will see next time, did end in failure. However, behind the high-profile and not-so-secret invading force, Brigade 2506, lay a much more sinister program, Operation 40, which would cement a lasting legacy into the CIA's dirty business from the 1960s to the 1980s. Op 40 represented the CIA's first foray into many avenues. It was their first attempt at developing a foreign intelligence apparatus, and in turn, they selected some of the most hardened and cold-blooded operators that would help the agency and other allied agencies work off the books to undertake their overtly criminal acts for the next decades. Operation 40 also saw the CIA begin to hone their assassination programs, but not in the typical establishment sense, but instead as a specifically trained death squad of sorts that could quote-unquote mop up the countryside, while Brigade 2506 men charged across Cuba. Finally, Operation 40 would become a key piece of the JFK assassination tapestry, as radical Cuban killers became increasingly frustrated with the perceived inaction of the president to return to Cuba. At least that's the official story. To get the full picture, we need to travel to Miami, Louisiana, and Las Vegas, where the CIA mob connection was being established by the private intelligence agent Robert Mayhew, a private intelligence asset of none other than Howard Hughes. Next time, we're going to Mobland, and we're exploring the CIA and Cuban exiles' tumultuous relationship with the Mafia and their place in the anti-Castro mythos. Thank you all for watching as always, and please, if you enjoyed this video in any way, leave a like and a comment down below, letting me know what you thought. It helps a lot with the algorithm, and as always, I really enjoy reading your thoughts down below. The video you watched today first aired to my Patreon subscribers on June 28th, 2024. I would not have been able to dedicate the time and effort away from friends and family producing this video without their generous support. Patreon supporters get all the videos for the upcoming season early before they premiere here on YouTube. Season 3 will be premiering throughout 2025 before it ends up on YouTube at the end of the year. On screen now are the names of my producer tier patrons. As you know, when you watch Eyes Wide Open on YouTube, it is always ad-free. I do not make any money off of YouTube ads, which allows me to say what I want and not worry about keeping my content within the confines of YouTube's stringent monetization policy. That said, I am completely dependent on individual support to do the work that I do. So as always, to the Patreon supporters, thank you very much for your ongoing and enduring support. Next week is another big one, focusing specifically on the CIA Mafia assassination plots against Castro. This will be the second longest documentary in Season 2, as I take a deep dive into US organized crime, Howard Hughes' private intelligence network, and the so-called mythology of the CIA plots against Castro. This is a massive hour and 20-minute episode that I can't wait to share with you all. We really go deep into some topics that I haven't really explored in the past. But as for the show today, this is all I've got, so thank you so much as always for watching. Again, a like and a comment goes a long way, and as always, remember to keep your eyes wide open. Take care.